Welcome to lecture part 6 of the total lecture series on normative ethical theories, but it's part 2 of lecture 3. So in the first part of lecture 3, we discussed the theory of ethical egoism. So if you've listened to that lecture, you now know all about ethical egoism, its key principles, and also some arguments in favor and against the theory of ethical egoism. So normative ethical theories, we've been discussing them for quite some time now. They provide us with principles that tell us when an act is right or wrong. Utilitarianism and ethical egoism look at the consequences of an act, whereas ethics of duty looks at the motives of an act. In this sixth part of today's lecture, or the lecture series on normative ethical theories, we're going to discuss the notion of rights and justice. So you might wonder, of course, why we are discussing rights and justice in a lecture series on normative ethical theories. Well, why discuss that? Because rights typically result in a duty to others to respect these rights, right? The rights of one person correspond to a duty on another person to respect these rights. To give an example, my right of freedom implies a duty for you to not infringe my freedom. And you might also come up with other examples, right? A right to privacy implies a duty for you not to, or to respect my privacy, etc. So we're going to discuss what rights are and also how rights should be distributed. Let's have a look at some theories and definitions of these theories. So if we're talking about rights, then we're talking about claims to which humans are entitled. And the concept of rights or natural rights was introduced in the 18th century by a philosopher called John Locke. He introduced the concept of natural rights. And these natural rights, they are basic entitlements, right? So basic things to which you have a claim or which you have a claim on. And these basic entitlements, they should be respected always and everywhere. So this means that we, as humans, without any exception, always have a claim to these rights. And you can think of rights to life, freedom, property, education, privacy, right? All these kind of typical examples that you probably also can come up with yourself if you think about the concept of human rights. Because that's how we normally, nowadays, think about rights. Rights that belong to any human, irrespective of your gender, your race, your nationality, etc. Right? They extend to everyone. So the concept of rights or natural rights also links to Kant's notion of human dignity. Remember that in lecture 2 we discussed the theory of Kant, of ethics of duty, and there we also discussed that all human beings have some degree of human dignity that we should respect, right? We can never treat humans as a means to an end, but we should always consider that they are an end in themselves. And with this concept of human dignity also comes the idea that we should respect the rights that sort of result from this idea that humans have a dignity that we should respect. So the duty to respect the rights, or let me rephrase, so the idea of rights inflicts a duty upon us to respect the rights of each human being. So this concept of human rights or natural rights arose in the same era as this idea of human dignity, right? It was in the era of the Enlightenment. And this was also the era where we had the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and this evolved later into the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. It's a very strong and fundamental concept because it gives us a claim to rights irrespective of who you are, where you're from, your age, etc. So it's a very fundamental concept, I would say. But it also has one very strong critique, and that is the critique that it's a very Western view of morality, right? It was the result of the developments in the Enlightenment age in the 18th century here in Western Europe. And therefore it's a very Western view of, well, what humans should be entitled to and what humans sort of characterizes. Now, if we move from rights to justice, then we should also wonder here, well, we can say that individuals have rights, but of course these rights, they should be realized in such a way that they are equally and fairly distributed. And then the question arises, well, what is a fair distribution? How should we distribute the goods and the means in a society such that all human rights are respected? So justice requires a fair or equal treatment of humans, and there are two sort of main views on this, and one is the fair procedures, the idea that there is procedural justice. You are free to acquire whatever you want without constraints. Right? This is also, if you think of an example, we have a right to education, right? The idea that everybody can access education and that eventually you have the right to a fair procedure when applying to a job, for example, that it does not matter where you're from, what kind of background you have, but everybody starts at an equal point of departure and will be, in terms of the procedures that are involved in an employment or in an application process, treated in a fair way. This does not necessarily imply that outcomes are also fairly or equally distributed, right? So a fair procedure does not necessarily imply a fair outcome. So if we also talk about fair outcomes, then we're looking at whether the consequences are fairly distributed, and we call this type of justice distributive justice. Right? So different ways of looking at justice, procedures versus outcomes. And now the question, of course, arises, well, what is a fair or equal distribution if we also look at doing business? Well, you all know the examples of CEO wages. Here is an overview of some of the highest paid CEOs in the world. And well, some might claim, well, they have done a very good job and they're just paid accordingly, and therefore they are receiving such a high wage. But you can also wonder, right? Are they entitled to their salary or not? What kind of base should we have if we think about salaries? Is effort enough, or is there something else that plays an important role? So you might, of course, wonder, well, what is a just distribution of wealth, of income, of status, of power? Should CEOs be awarded enormous salaries at the expense of employee salaries? Should expensive medical procedures be available only to those who can afford them? And is it fair that most wealth is concentrated in Western countries? Well, these are all questions that arise if we think about justice, about distribution of means of production, of income, of goods across the globe. And we're going to look at a couple of perspectives on or that can help us to answer these questions. So if we think about the distribution of goods in society, there are two extreme positions. Of course, there is a whole range of different answers, but we're going to look at two extreme positions that you can use to sort of, well, get an idea of how perspectives on distribution differ from each other. One perspective is the perspective of strict egalitarianism, and we also call that egalitarianism. It's already a bit in the name, egalitarianism, equal. So this type of distribution or distributive justice proposes that justice is the same as equality, right? So a just distribution of goods implies that goods, burdens, and services are equally distributed across people. And we will look into this a bit more in the next slide. Opposed to strict egalitarianism is a position that we call non-egalitarianism. And of course, it's already in the name. It's a negation of egalitarianism, right? So it does not imply equality. justice is not equal to equality, because they propose that equality has no intrinsic value. Non-egalitarianists, on the other hand, they propose that justice is a product of a free market, right? A market where there is no coercion, there is no pressure, and people can freely conduct their businesses. And if they do so, then the outcome is actually a just distribution. Also, this perspective we're going to discuss in a couple of minutes in more detail. So let us look at this position of strict egalitarianism. So I already mentioned that from an egalitarianist point of view, justice is equality, right? So if you want to have a just distribution of goods, of services, of burdens, then that implies from a strict egalitarianist point of view that everyone should have the same amount of goods, burdens, and services. Any deviation from sort of the equal position where all these goods and services are distributed equally are unjust from this perspective. If you think a bit about examples in our world, then probably the communist perspective or the communist economic system is probably most egalitarian, right? As all means of production were collectively owned there. But you can also think of well, tax systems that are proportional or arranged in a way to sort of distribute goods or redistribute goods, that this is also a way to at least approach this ideal of a strict egalitarian distribution of goods. Well, if you think a bit about egalitarianism, I can imagine that most of you might say, well, it's actually a very interesting position. It sounds really fair. But of course, a main problem with this position is that there are, of course, differences to people. And how should we value those differences? Some people might be better at certain skills than others. Some people are physically also different, so how are we going to adjust for such differences? And do we actually need to correct for those too? Some people might also put in more effort to attain a certain outcome. Well, what about getting what we deserve, right? So you might wonder a bit, or you might question these questions. I think they're also very valid points if you think about the position of strict egalitarianism. And also linked to this, imagine that you want to see Ronaldo play, and you can get tickets for that via some kind of auction system. Then if you are going to this auction and you are fine with paying $1,000 for a ticket to see Ronaldo play, then what's actually the problem? You have earned this money. You really want to see Ronaldo play. It might be sort of your dream come true. Everybody pays voluntarily. What is the problem? Is there actually an issue if you think about this? It's not an egalitarian outcome, but you might see that there is nothing really wrong with paying voluntarily to see something or to do something that you really want. So a position that sort of aligns with this intuition is that of non-egalitarianism. And I already mentioned this very briefly to you at the beginning of this lecture, that opposed to egalitarianism, we have the position of non-egalitarianism, which claims that equality has no intrinsic value. So this means that for a non-egalitarianist, outcomes do not necessarily have to be equal, so justice has to be realized elsewhere. So for example, through the process, a fair process of the market, which we also call libertarianism. And one of the defenders of the libertarian position, or the non-egalitarian position, is a philosopher called Robert Nozick. He was a 20th century philosopher, and he actually proposed a non-egalitarian perspective on justice. He argued that a just distribution of goods is one in which each person is entitled to their possessions. So if you want to pay $1,000 to see Ronaldo play and you have earned these $1,000 fairly, you've worked for it, then this is actually a just outcome because you've worked for it and you have fairly traded it. So there's no theft, no deception or use of force. And these two conditions, right? So you're entitled to your possessions and there is no form of theft, deception or use of force. So there is a fair way of earning your entitlements. If these are met, then the outcome of any distribution, according to Robert Nozick, is a fair, a just distribution of goods and resources. So this perspective is also called entitlement theory, right? You're entitled to the efforts of your labor, given that you have fairly traded for it. And it's assumed in a way that all participants in the market are equal, right? Everybody is equal to each other and they can transact with each other, they can work, and if they do so, the outcome will be a just outcome. Maybe you've already an idea about this, but this also gives rise to a problem, right? If the market assumes that all participants are equal, then, well, you might already realize we're not all equal, right? There are differences in income, in ability, in health, in luck. These often prevail, and well, from this perspective, this non-egalitarian perspective, this of course will lead to an unjust outcome, right? Outcomes are distributed unfairly on a global level, and it's not true that we're all equal participants in this market, in this process of the market that Robert Nozick is such a strong proponent for. So there is also a position that we could say, well, it's sort of in the middle between the strict egalitarian position that equates justice to equality and the position of non-egalitarianism that we just discussed. Rawls, or John Rawls, was a 20th century philosopher that was concerned with the question, what is a just distribution? He wrote a book about this called A Theory of Justice, and this is still much used, much read during any philosophy study. And we're also going to discuss that today because it's a very interesting, I would say, perspective on a fair distribution of goods. So he came up with some kind of theory of justice in which there are two key features. He thought of a thought experiment, a hypothetical contract approach, we call that. And from this hypothetical thought experiment, he came up with two principles of justice. So I want to first discuss his thought experiment, and then I will introduce these two principles that are key to his theory of justice. So John Rawls, he questioned how should we decide on principles of justice, right? You might think of an egalitarian perspective, a non-egalitarian perspective, but there are actually problems to both of these positions. We just saw them and discussed them. So when we have to decide on how to distribute goods in society, we often, of course, differ in what we think is right or wrong according to our position in society. You're poor, you might be very well off, you might be advantaged or disadvantaged in terms of your physical abilities or in luck in life. And of course, all these sort of characteristics, individual characteristics, will also influence how you perceive the world. If you're a very rich person, probably you think, or you have a different perspective on what is right or wrong than when you would have been a very poor person. And John Rawls thought, well, of course, these sort of characteristics, individual characteristics in terms of income, in terms of physical abilities, in terms of luck, upbringing, they will influence how you perceive right or wrong, and also the distribution that is linked to that. So John Rawls proposed a thought experiment, and the idea of this thought experiment is to imagine yourself in a position where you can choose, irrespective of the political or social arrangement in your society, right? So is it a left-wing government, a right-wing? Are you under a free market or a communist regime, etc.? So prior to any existing political or social arrangement, we're going to imagine what kind of principles of justice should govern our society. And John Rawls called this position the original position. Maybe you sometimes hear my dog, by the way. He's lying under my desk. So this thought experiment, first step would be to imagine ourselves in the original position, right? So irrespective of any social arrangements that we typically enjoy when living in a society, we're going to sort of ignore them. They're not there. We imagine ourselves in some kind of position where all these kind of arrangements are not there yet. And we're going to wonder, well, what kind of principles of justice would we endorse? So John Rawls proposed that in order to eliminate any biases and to ensure a fair outcome when being in this original position, we should imagine ourselves behind a veil of ignorance. And this really is a veil, right? Something that covers yourself, and it makes you ignorant about your economic background, your talents, your privileges, and any other circumstances that determine how you enjoy, experience life, right? So you do not know your gender, your age, whether you're good at mathematics or very bad. You do not know whether you have any physical disabilities, right? We do not know anything. So we're in this original position in a society that is not really shaped in the way a society is shaped as we know societies nowadays. And also individually, we're behind a veil of ignorance, right? So we do not know anything about the characteristics that we actually have. And in this situation, John Rawls says that we should imagine or question what kind of principles of justice would we endorse. Well, if we are in this original position and behind a veil of ignorance, according to John Rawls, there would be two principles that people would come up with. All individuals, irrespective of their position in society, would would decide that they want more rather than less of the so-called primary social goods. And with these primary social goods, he means income, rights, liberties, opportunities, status, self-respect, etc. Right? So, and I guess it's also very intuitive, right? You would like to be in a position that is probably the best rather than the least of options. And with this, he called this the Maximin principle. So individuals will follow the principle in which they will choose to maximize the minimum of these social primary social goods that they will receive, right? So out of all the distributions that you could choose, you will choose the the distribution that maximizes the minimum of goods, right? I'll give you an example in a bit to illustrate this further. And this results in two key principles, and this is actually sort of the main takeaway of John Rawls' theory of justice, and this is also what you will have to remember of this lecture, is that if we want to decide upon a just distribution of resources, we would come up with two principles. The first being that all people have the same basic liberties, which come down to human rights. And on top of that, social and economic inequalities are allowed. So there can be differences in how resources are distributed, but they should be to the greatest benefit of the least advantage. This is where this Maximin principle comes in, right? So the least advantaged should be best off if you compare distributions, and they also should be attached to offices and positions open to all under the conditions of equality of opportunity, right? So this excludes, discrimination at the job market, for example, right? So you cannot be discriminated based on your characteristics because you should be able to, yeah, to have an equal opportunity to become a certain person or to get a certain job. Yeah, so these are the two key principles: same basic liberties, and then the second one, inequalities are allowed based on two conditions. Let me give you a case example, and then we will conclude today's lecture. So this is a distribution of resources. Imagine this is just a society where we have a footballer, a worker, a PM, and a teacher. And everybody in this society gets an equal amount of goods. So this we would call the first distribution, we would call it an egalitarian outcome, right? Everybody receives the same income, or whatever we're actually looking at is distributed equally. Now, of course, we can also redistribute these outcomes. So we still have the same total amount of resources, but redistributed. And this would be, of course, an unequal distribution. From an egalitarian point of view, the distribution in P2 would be typically characterized as unjust, right? Distribution is not equal. From a non-egalitarian point of view, this could be a just outcome on the condition that everybody is entitled to their income, they worked for it, and they also gained this income without coercion or theft or any kind of fraud. If these two conditions are met, then also from a non-egalitarian point of view, P2 would actually be a just outcome, a just distribution. For roles, on the other hand, it could be that this is not a just distribution. Imagine that there would also be the option to choose for distribution P3 and P4. Now the question is, well, what kind of preference would roles have? Inequalities are allowed, so we could decide, or any distribution of P2, P3, or P4 could be a just distribution if we think about Rawls, his principle. But if you also remember the second condition, it described that the least well off should be the best of. Now if we compare distributions P2, P3, and P4, then the teachers are the worst off in each of these distributions, right? In distribution 2, the teacher receives, in distribution 2, it's the worker actually, but the worker is better off in distribution 3 and 4, so this would be preferred from the perspective of the worker. And if we look at the teacher, then P4 would also be preferred. They would receive 10 instead of 9 or 3. So for roles, probably the distribution 4 would be preferred. Interestingly, this is actually not the distribution that maximizes total welfare, right? So a utilitarian would probably choose distribution 3, as the distribution there, total welfare, comes down to 47 instead of 45. Right, so maybe have a look at these examples and see if you can also, well, if you can come up with the arguments why an egalitarian would choose distribution 1 and why roles would choose distribution 4. Well, just to recap today's lecture, this sixth part in the series on normative ethical theories, John Rawls proposes that a just distribution consists of a distribution where all people have the same basic liberties, human rights, and that inequalities can exist as long as they are to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged and attached to offices and positions under all conditions of equality of opportunity. Right? So high salaries and bonuses can be justified for roles if the least well-off profit more than under any other arrangements. So if you remember also the example that we started this lecture with, where the CEOs were receiving super high bonuses, if this goes together with employees receiving a higher wage than in any other arrangement, for John Rawls, this would still be a just distribution, even though it's not an egalitarian distribution. Right. So this was it for today. Thank you for listening to me. And then I will see you in the next clip, in which we're going to discuss a couple of theories, among which the theory of virtue ethics. Looking forward to seeing you there. Bye.